Welcome, everybody. And here we are again at Over the Mountains. And I'm continuing to interview my beloved Rufus Pollock. And today, the angle I want to tackle is why movement building makes a difference. Why would it make a difference to coming into a new future uh, of a second renaissance? And so, Rufus, can you first maybe tell us a little bit? Because what I found particular with you in the space is that you're someone who spends quite a bit of effort in doing movement building. You've done that with open knowledge. Um, can you tell us a little bit, for example, and also that, for example, in the tech sphere, movement building is a little bit less common for the reason we've covered maybe before. Where did you see that building a movement made a difference in the open information? Uh, how did building a movement make a difference in terms of opening information?
Yeah, so the question we have is why is movement building important? And the basic answer to that is because collective action is important. Like if you most of the issues that we face from like the climate crisis, the ecological to how do we govern technology that could be super powerful, nuclear weapons, super intelligence, through to just like we want a different education system or we want a different way to have rules for the information age, which we talked about in the previous episode. All of those come back to enacting rules together, and that requires collective action. It requires people to come together, and particularly collective action to like enact something politically. It's not just we need to vote. We need to get motivated. People need to spend time and effort that they could spend going to the bar or down the pub or watching Netflix. They need to spend it engaging with their fellow citizens for change. And that takes effort. It takes organizing. Uh,
But can you tell us, like, where, for example, how did it make a difference? Did it make any difference? I guess why I'm asking this question, and I might play a little bit the devil's advocate in a world where, today as we see that people are less engaged civically, and there's often a bit that sense of like, one, maybe being part of a political movement is not as cool, but also a sense that maybe it doesn't work. Um, and I'd love to understand, like, in a way, if you were speaking to young people, like explain, like that don't believe this could work or make a difference, how does it work and how does it make a difference?
it just,
We
this
don't hear
but
yourself.
this is where we have to talk about over the mountains because we have to kind of be honest, right? So the issue is we are in a world obsessed with shortcuts and hacks. We live in a world where people think, oh, this thing is hard. Like going to the gym and like working out is hard. Oh, there's a pill I can take that I'll lose weight instead. We live in a world, oh, I'm not going to have to sit on a cushion to get enlightened. I can just go and do ayahuasca on a weekend and boom, I'm awakened. Um, uh, you know, just I don't need to write my essays anymore. I can get AI to do it. We just live in a world where, partly related often to technology, there's this obsession with what I would call hacks and shortcuts. Now, there's nothing, in some areas, they're not hacks and shortcuts, they work. Technology is kind of magical. I don't have to spend months sending a letter over the world by a ship. I can send it via the internet in an email in seconds or milliseconds. The issue that's gone on, I think, so there's several things I want to say here is that people have confused where technology and this kind of magical acceleration of things or shortcutting of things works and where it doesn't. So
Mm,
because they think it works in sending an email, they think it works in sorting out democratic governance. There's this basically what I would call a category error when, if I mistake a snake for a rope and try picking it up, I get bitten and die. So when I make really big category errors between something, when I think a rope is a snake, sorry, a snake is a rope, or vice versa, I think a rope is a snake and I avoid it, um, this has big impacts. And so essentially, one of the things about technology, we're coming on a lot about technology, but the world of modernity, which is this kind of magic of technology, and that goes back hundreds of years. Like the philosophers of the of early modernity, like Descartes, were like just really like infatuated in a way, kind of by what was happening in science. Descartes wanted metaphysics to be like maths. He was a mathematician, actually, a brilliant mathematician and a brilliant philosopher. And people were just looking at what was going on in science and mathematics, and wanting to imitate it because it's just so kind of amazing. The breakthroughs that you're having, the what you're able to kind of work out. And then there's this tendency to want to apply those ideas and that way of thinking about the world and imagining that those things will work in other areas, right?
Mm,
And so you end up in a world where you think that there are these kind of magical shortcuts to things,
mm,
and um, that that that's very problematic when it's misapplied, when you have a category error. And so I've just got to start with because the issue I'm going to say is basically collective action movement route is hard. It's why we have the title of the series is Over the Mountains. It's both a metaphor for getting to the long journey to a second renaissance, but really the over the mountains part is really collective action and movement building. It stands for that. And the metaphor we mentioned before, Lord of the Rings, there's this moment they're trying to go to Mount Doom, to throw the ring in. And they're trying to go over the mountain, like, oh, it's too difficult. Saruman is against us. We'll go. There's this shortcut through the mountains.
mm,
Rather than having to go over them, there's this kind of the dwarves have got this path, and of course it's actually disastrous. I mean, the Balrog shows up, Gandalf is killed. Obviously, in the book, he has to have a way back, so Gandalf is somehow magically resurrected. But in any normal book, that would be game over. That would have been
mm,
the end of Lord of the Rings, right? That they try to take this cool shortcut. Their major player is wiped out by a Balrog, and they're basically cornered. Um, so there's why I'm saying this is you just got to start out kind of going, oh, people look at it's like I'm going to go to the gym for a year to really like get fit. Oh, that's too hard. Isn't there something easier? Maybe I can buy that thing that like I just plug on my leg and massages me while I'm watching Netflix, and then I get all muscle toned. And so
mm,
you kind of got to a little bit deal with the fact that people think there are all these shortcuts and hacks. And I know we need to go into that, but kind of in terms of answering the question, the answer is partly like you lose a lot in movement building and collective action against concentrated interests. But it's the
mm,
only if it's kind of like the only way. It's like going over the mountains is hard. Some of you might even die, but it's not, there's no other option. There's really no other option for the things that we want to do uh,
mm.
most of the time. And that's
But can you give us example of what it has achieved? Like
yes.
what it has achieved?
Well,
That
I,
was
I,
my
I would point out that almost everything that we value uh, has come from that in terms of political change. So the civil rights movement was successful. That involved mobilizing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the core of the civil rights movement, inspired by Martin Luther King and other leaders, and then also a much larger group of people who sympathized with that to support, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act in the 60s. In fact, in 1957 as well, the Civil Rights, there's an act. The end of slavery, legal slavery, at least in England, involves collective action, building a coalition for that change. I mean, collective action uh, shows up almost everywhere successfully. It's often difficult and it's slow relatively. That's the thing, and you don't always win. In the area I specifically was working in, which is open knowledge and you know addressing monopoly rights, there were victories. Yeah, there were. It We can come to why motivated me to look so much at collective action, because that's an area where you see collective action problem, which particularly is that broad interests that need to act together can often be outmaneuvered by a much smaller interest, but which is concentrated.
Mm,
You can think of it in a battle. If there's one small group of highly organized troops, they can defeat a much larger group who are poorly organized and just, not well equipped and not thing. And that happened a lot in that area because basically in copyright and other things, let's say you're the music industry and you can change copyright in some way, you can extend your monopoly to make it longer, for example.
Mhm.
That benefits you at the cost of everyone else.
Mhm.
Even asymmetrically, they even lose more than you gain. Like you might get 100 million, but the society loses 500 million,
Mhm.
dollars. But if you think of like $500 million in the population of Europe, that's about a dollar and a half for every person, or the US, about a dollar and a half each person. No individual person is going to do anything to get a dollar and a half. They're not going to spend an evening writing to their congressman or going to Washington to tell their representative not to do it. But if you're the music industry, you might well spend $10 million. You can get together and spend $10 million on lobbyists, on people to go and talk to politicians, paying aging, music stars to go and, you can, get Paul McCartney to show up and say, or Cliff Richard, we should have this thing, and that can work. And so I was very vividly exposed to that in an area that has very clear examples of collective action problem of groups needing to act together, citizens needing to act together against some other interest in
Mhm.
this case. And I saw us lose several times and also win. So there was one huge victory that I was involved in 2005, in which I was involved with a group called the Foundation for Free Information Infrastructures. That basically, I actually joined relatively late, but I ended up leading the group in the European Parliament when we did the final push to basically have something not, in a way, not happen to stop a major piece of legislation that was going to introduce patents for software in Europe. So there was an extend patents into this new area. And we actually managed to defeat that legislation at the last moment. I mean, it seemed almost hopeless. And somehow, people were like, rowing boats with flags on them outside of the parliament in Strasbourg, where there's like a little lake and things like that, and that was an incredible achievement. It was thought unthinkable. I mean, like 2 weeks before the vote, it was the site we were never going to win, and we did, and that was extraordinary. But the history of intellectual property stuff is that you normally lose as the group representing citizens, but you can win, and in general, in the long run, you do win. I think that's the thing to really remember, that in the long run, often we have won. Often, democracy has happened. It took a long time. Women did get the vote. Women, there were women who gave their lives, who engaged in civil disobedience in England, who, one woman ran onto the race course and was trampled to death by horses as protest. There were women putting out bombs, basically bombing letterboxes. People, a lot of women put themselves at risk, and then they built a movement that women got the vote, and they did.
Mhm.
Um, and I think the other thing I want to emphasize is that you can, to go back to open knowledge, one of the insights for me about movement building is that it's not necessarily classically building a political movement in the sense that you're pushing for a particular legislative change, like this law to be enacted. That is maybe that might be the end point of a whole effort. It's like the point when it gets institutionalized. But before that, you're doing a lot of kind of what I'd say cultural activism or advocacy to change hearts and minds.
Mm.
So, like let's say when Martin Luther King and others are doing like civil rights marches, there might ultimately be a piece of legislation they want enacted. But most of all, at the beginning, they're just trying to make people aware of the issue and create understanding and sympathy and support in a broad way. So, a lot of what you're trying to do is at the beginning change the discourse. And this goes back also to our first episode of what I would say sometimes, the other side have done, like the American Enterprise Institute. You spend all this time, you fund think tanks, you write policy papers, you get things into newspapers, you fund grassroots coalitions. Like, who is funding Charlie Kirk? There's a bunch of rich donors who are funding Charlie Kirk, to basically build a little mass, youth movement.
They've been very effective.
Yeah, very effective. Whatever one thinks positively or negative, Charlie Kirk, and as I said, just to say it really clear, we've said in other episodes, that political violence that kind is absolutely, unacceptable. I think that kind of stuff, the assassination of, the killing or murder of Charlie Kirk. The thing that I'm so what I'm saying though is that at Open Knowledge, and I think in general, there was a shift. That we were part, and I think of a broader shift in attitude. Now, how successful? I think there were many things that I wish we had been more successful at, but we did stop software patent legislation. It was like unprecedented. I think in the whole history of the European Union, there had never been a directive that was supported by the Commission and the Council of Ministers that had been rejected at second reading, like we managed to do. And, for example, there was a copyright extension by the music industry. The example I gave was a real one. And I remember Larry Lessig telling me, "Look, it's hopeless, Rufus. You'll never stop them. The music industry will win." I thought we could actually defeat them, and I think we came close to doing so. But in the end, they rather than getting 40 years extension, they only got 20 years. There was a compromise. So they managed to keep the Beatles records in copyright, basically. The Beatles records were about to come out of copyright and be public domain, at least the recordings, and they got another 20 years of the Beatles records. So the Beatles got even richer. But yeah, like there were victories, and I think there was a more systemic victory that the ideas of open data and open knowledge and open information became kind of more pervasive. So that, for example, there's a whole movement in US, Europe to make government data open, for example. These were things which again initially were not being supported at all and which are now kind of like default. So there were real successes, and you can look across society. There's so many successes. I mean, just think of environmental legislation. Whatever the challenges we've had, compared to 50 years ago, there are vastly more attention and law that make sure that we look after the environment better. It may fall a long way short of what we would like, potentially. And in some ways, maybe it's got over bureaucratized, but in general, there's been vast advances from political and social action and movement building in the environmental movement, uh,
Mhm.
for example. So there
And
are,
so,
yeah,
so there was this kind of first chapter of your life of like doing quite a bit of movement building around the area of open.
yeah.
And one thing that is happening around the Second Renaissance is also planting the seeds of a movement for a Second Renaissance, for a meta-modern reality. And I think I really want to like um, talk to that. And I like what you said. It's like, oh, it's first maybe not yet political as a political party, but first like allowing people to become more familiarized with those ideas or building sympathy. And indeed, in maybe you see in the conservative right wing Christian evangelical, you see that they've been very organized in doing movement building, and it's starting to pay off. And I think I want to also maybe speak to a thing of like, um, well, I, as being half French, France, I always say like, oh, you want to go to a strike because that's almost a French tradition. And there's something very powerful to be part of feel that you're part of a movement. When I read books about the Civil War in China, of like the communist movement, and how people speak about what inspired them, what touched them, of feeling part of a vision, feeling part of a movement, the empowerment it gives to people. Now, sometime I would find that a bit disturbing and uncomfortable, because in this identification with a movement comes also at times blindness. Um, uh,
Mm,
is like going to, but we are a bit in a moment where there's a lack of vision. The vision is like, you know, all about the individual and uh, taking the comfort of the individual. But there's something intoxicating when you're part of a movement with people are by your side, brother or sister. Maybe there was also something for me when my mom would take me to church, And which church has this element also, or Christianity has this element of a bit of movement inside. And you have people in that church that um, you might not match so much in personality, but you're all part of this movement, this family. Mm, and when people act together, the efficiency, or how to say, when a group comes together and like the way we have it at the hub, like if suddenly we're like, okay, everybody, let's clear the barn or raise the barn, like there's an efficiency of what we can fulfill in a day compared to, one or two person at the time. And I guess I want to speak to that because it's not just like, oh, in terms of strategy, this is the right thing to do, like it will allow us to kind of like win, but it's also that while doing it, I believe it's also something that brings deep joy, a deep sense of belonging, and is maybe just some time to kind of like make sure that one movement does not fall again into dogmatism and into like
Yeah.
us against them. Because in movement building, there's often that sense of like making wrong the current situation, um, and opposing, like creating an opposition. And if I belong to this movement, I don't belong to another. So I don't know. I'm touching several things.
Hey,
Guess what I'm trying to say is like, oh, and the opportunity of movement building is not just to fulfill on a vision, but it's also while you're doing that movement building, there's this belonging, there's this brotherhood, that sisterhood, that collectivity that is so nourishing. And finally, to also be like, hey, we want to be a bit safeguarding also of not falling into a certain like certain blind spot of movement building.
yes. So, I mean, first, very good point that I think there's something even deeply nourishing about participating in something greater than ourselves and being in kind of brotherhood and sisterhood or part of community. And then I think it's worth observing that at the moment, often the two kind of offers or two options on the table is either kind of reactionary movement,
Yeah.
which again we could admire. I want to say something like I look kind of almost admire the American Enterprise Institute and the evangelical efforts. Particularly evangelicals, like they're standing for something they really care about. I think kind of genuinely, often like they think whatever I might really disagree with their position on gay rights or something like that, but I can see that they're coming from something maybe very authentic and very touched in their heart and very, authentic, genuine, and they're kind of very organized and kind of disciplined and thoughtful about what they've been doing, and we could kind of learn from that and be appreciative of those things. But to say there's in general, the reactionary movement, in the worst case, it's kind of the Nuremberg rallies. It's like we kind of submerge ourselves in the collective and for some kind of reactionary ideology that's taking us back into a kind of tribalism or a kind of imagined past of blood and soil or whatever it is. On the other side, and I think this is actually more important for our discussion, is what I would say postmodern movements. And the issue with postmodern movements is, well, there's several, but I think the epitome of it was a photo of the Gilets jaunes protests that happened in France in the late 2010s, which were this kind of almost like just bottom up, self-organizing protest started out over basically a raise in the duty on tax on petrol, and people put on yellow vests, and there were real started out to be real protests and classic French strikes. But there was a photo I saw in the Place de la République in Paris, and on the back of the jacket is written "fuck the system." And it doesn't say like build a new system. It doesn't offer any kind of positive direction. It's just like and a kind of anarchism of like any system is kind of oppressive. I think the postmodern aspect beyond kind of classic anarchism is this aspect that any ideology or any system is kind of almost necessarily oppressive. Everyone has to bring their own truth. And more significantly for movements, there can be kind of no leadership. And in fact, Gilets jaunes, this was classic. Like at some point in the Gilets jaunes protests, there was a group of people who said, well, why don't we actually try and get elected as members of the European Parliament, because it was the European Parliament elections. And this group kind of put themselves forward. And then other people in the group said, who are you to put yourselves forward? And because it was an organization with no structure, there was no way to decide how would anyone represent the Gilets jaunes? How would anyone be a Gilets jaunes MEP? Because there was no structure. And kind of the whole thing fell apart and kind of infighting over who had authority and whose truth is more valid than anyone else's. So I I'm bringing this up because I think one of the things that's hampered us is that in in this area, often we kind of got this dichotomy of either a movement is this submersion back into the collective, where I kind of submerge my identity, or I have these kind of hyper individualistic movements, which are really like everyone just getting to express their own needs and desires. But when there's no real ability to then cohere, to make, for example, clear political demands, to actually act together, to enact those requests, and so on, it's more like just a protest. And again, this is a critique that's made of the Occupy movement, maybe more or less accurately, but that it could never end up generating actually clear requests of what was wanted because it was organized on this sort of almost postmodern, very horizontal principles.
Well, it's also
And
why
built, yeah,
movement built for to take something down. It's like we're against that. We don't agree with that.
yes,
But it doesn't ever offer say we don't want this and this is the proposition. The new it doesn't come with a proposition. Um, and there I think it for me I see a bit the roots of there's something powerful in postmodernity of like questioning truth, questioning, partially because indeed authority has often been abused. But what is this questioning at the service of? Is the questioning at the service of actually truth, finding a path, or is it questioning just to take down? Because questioning can be a very destructive force, but if one has to sense like what is this questioning at the service of? Is it um to question in order to offer like with an offering, or to pursue a deeper truth, or is it questioning just to take down? um and yeah, I like please sorry, I've intervened a little bit there. um but I think it's related to the point you were saying about, oh, in postmodernity there's this there's strikes, a critique that are very valid, but what doesn't allow us to kind of come through is that there's no proposition. But to have a proposition, you need to have a sense of truth and a good and a direction you want to go, and one that is better than the other. um, and often I sense that in one big thing in postmodernity is that we don't believe in uh, a truth, but we don't believe in truth, but that itself is taken as a truth, and it's become like a snake that bites its own tail. And so they cannot be any collective direction.
right, yeah. I mean, we're coming. I don't know if we want to go into it, but the general critique of of postmodernity, the performative contradiction that Habermas and others pointed out of, there is no truth, but that is a truth,
And
and so on. I guess
we're pointing to that because with Over the Mountain, there's a sense of there's a direction, there's
there
somewhere
is
to
a direction, yes.
go. It's
So
not. Yes.
yeah, so I mean, maybe we're going to a different point that we might want to come to. I don't know if we're going to come to it now or in another episode, which is that behind the idea of going over the mountains is you have some sense of you want to go over the mountains, you know a direction you're going in, and there might be multiple paths people take over the mountain, and there might even be some variety in the destinations over the mountains of the land there. That it's not there's just one place one's going to, but with it, there's maybe several valleys, but there is a direction and there is a sense of of up. I think we often like to say we're not necessarily saying there's the truth, but we sense that no one has the truth, but you can be more or less in the direction of the truth. Um, it's like a mountain where I can't see the top, but I can sense that there's an up in the
Mm.
mountain, and that's really important. And again, a point that, for example, Habermas and I think Wilber makes really well in sex ecology and spirituality and other books. So I suppose just to go back, one of the things is to kind of that we could also mention is there's a sort of trauma about the collective in modernity and particularly post-modernity. Like I think particularly actually almost post-modernity of the oppression of the group. But that's also there even in modernity where we kind of escape religion. You know, we have these huge cultural traumas, at least in the West, about the collective. And
Mm-mm-mm.
one of the things in order to go back is we're trying to go into create kind of a new form of collective
Mm.
that is not the um that neither goes back into the tribe, but neither becomes lost in this kind of individual horizontalism. We want something that manages to do a sort of alchemy of the two. And so that's something one is trying to create. You're trying to create a new kind of movement that does have direction, does have coherence, and yet is non-dogmatic in a certain way, is non-oppressive, is you know is open-minded in a variety of ways. Yeah.
There's a point I really wanted to make, mostly because I'm concerned I will forget that point. I'm into
Sure.
I think there's also something very important in movement building that is almost counterintuitive in the kind of main ideology of individualism that of today, which is about the collective. Um, we don't see actually a lot of move like young people being involved in movements in general, I would say. Um, Partially, I think because one is like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't believe that movement makes a difference, so we're not involved. But it's also by believing so much of like the importance of the individual, we also don't engage in in collective, and movement have a dimension of collectivity. And there's also a sense of like, how say, one individual might not be able to make that much a difference, but a movement really can. Grassroots movement, we've seen like you see it with the gay rights movement that has been very grassroots. Also, by the way, so we talked about, maybe how the evangelical Christian have been a movement, but like the LGBTQ has been a movement and has been very effective at, changing the narrative, advocating for their cases, and and changing people's perception. Um, and there is a power to grassroots movement. And I think I want to point to that because still sense that I like to say that this kind of second renaissance or meta-modern movement is a little, or liminal web, liminal time, sorry, not web, liminal time, is a little bit like a three-headed cypress dog in the sense of the underworld dog. If people don't know that mythology, the hell is guarded by Cyprus, which is a three-headed dog of the underworld, and it's a little bit like, oh, there's still not fully a coherence in the sense like there's a body, there's a sense of an identity, but it's still not really fully come together, and it's quite unknown. And I think there's a power, uh, there's a discomfort in the moment of alignment because we at the moment maybe everybody like we think we talk about the same thing, but are we really talking about the same thing? Do we really agree or not? And that moment to maybe realize we don't agree on the path forward, or we do agree, or it's a
Mm.
a little bit like there's sometimes we play the game of confusion because in confusion you can navigate certain things, but there's also a lack of there's less there's a power, how to say, there's a power that comes with clarity, because then you can really create consent. When you say this is what we stand for, you can really create consent, you can really create consensus, and you can really create um, the power of movement, the power of direction. Um, and I think that has been one of the thing of like, at least around the idea of second renaissance, of making certain points more explicit so that we can create consensus, we can create consent, because that's a key dimension of movement building. If there's no clarity, you waste a lot of time like uh how say bashing around, like kind of
Yeah.
like um uh Yes. And so there's also an importance of clarity, of maybe different clarity of differences. Okay, this is how we want to approach the mountain. Maybe others would approach it from a different angle. And it's, and or even what is the mountain? Where is the peak of the mountain? Is it over there? Is it over there? We might have a disagreement of which peak to climb.
Exactly. No, I think it's a very good point that in early movements, and I think there's this other metaphor that I like that we've used, which is imagine you're on Mars, um, and on Mars there's no atmosphere, so you're going to have to create kind of domes or like membranes that then then has the oxygen and so on in it. The bigger you make that membrane, the thinner the membrane is, and therefore the less dense the air is. So if you as you kind of try and sometimes when you're trying to do a movement, you're like, let's kind of make it as big as possible. Let's include everyone that we possibly can. But then what happens is what you actually stand for is very dilute. It's very, very, and it's very, there's not very much air there. There's not very much oxygen. So there's not a lot of energy. And there's this kind of sometimes trade-off between being clear about what you stand for and what you're doing. And that clarity could also be useful. There can be different membranes which people are under, which are kind of even close to each other, but which are acting. I mean, this is getting a little bit detailed, but saying one of the things in at least the Second Renaissance initiative that and the Second Renaissance visioning is to say this both is really building on and derived from and taking from many things in this kind of meta-modern liminal web Second Renaissance in the broad sense space, but it is also a specific envisioning, and that's important. And I think I think we're going in a different thing. Just to say that one of the crucial things here that I think we're occupied with is how do you build a collective action and build movements and ecosystems of action that can go beyond both the modern or even pre-modern reaction type movement, like the kind of the past, and go beyond the postmodern protest individual expression to something that is a kind of new way of organizing potentially. But at the same time, recognizing, we probably do need to have like policy requests at some point. This is what we want in terms of legislation or the way society is organized. These are, and to try and enact those. And I think the thing I also want to say is people what I take and what inspires me actually about sometimes the US example is in the case of, let's say, the evangelical right, is what you can do if you're willing to organize for a few decades. And so I see and say, like, listen, if there were groups listening to this podcast said, and you said, listen, there's 10 of us, and you really dedicate yourself over the next 20 years, you'll get elected mayor of a major city or, past president, or, you can really make a difference. And, a small group of you can then, in a sense, not that the group is doing anything kind of secretly, what I mean is you can be part of a larger group, you can build a larger group and larger efforts and really enact stuff. And as I said, in the US, the Republican Party candidate normally needs the approval of the evangelical right now to be on the platform. And we could imagine a world where in 20 years, you need to be endorsing key parts of like a second Renaissance meta-modern political platform to have a chance of being elected. I mean, that's happened on the Green side. There are very few Green parties that have actually formally won exclusive power, but the Green movement and environmental parties have completely shifted politics. And in some countries, they are close to winning power. I mean, in the UK right now, there's a suggestion that the Green Party might replace the Labour Party as the alternative party, and the Reform will replace the Conservatives. So just to really emphasize, that's been like 50 years, 40 years. I think the first official Green Party is like, I think Germany, 1980. I have to check my dates. But the first like party dedicated to environmental green issues is founded basically 45 years ago. Um, and yet, even 20 years ago, 25 years ago, they're starting to have major, electoral impacts in certain countries. So I think there is real hope to make a difference. That's why I want to maybe emphasize, and you were asking at the beginning, is people overestimate what they can do in a year and they underestimate what they can do in a decade. And we really underestimate what we can do through collective action and cultural activism in on the decadal kind time scale.
Yeah,
And
we underestimate also what we can do in 100 years.
yes, massively. And so I think if people are willing to take on that mindset, and that's even one of the things we'd like to see as part of a second Renaissance world, I think is a greater attention to the future and to the long term, and that kind of a more patient mindset. I don't know if that's a good point, by the way.
To see yourself as an ancestor, that you're there. It's not about, it's about you, but it's not really about you. Is that you have children or not? You are an ancestor and you're going to transmit something to the next generation. And so, what is it that you want to transmit to the next generation? And so, if you start thinking like that, of like seven generation down, you take things in a completely different perspective and your action changes because you might not play a short game, but a long game. And you might create really the conditions for the next generation to flourish. And that doesn't mean that while you create the condition for the next generations to flourish, that you don't attend your own flourishing. But I think it's also shifting also that individualistic mindset of saying that the interbeing is not just interbeing with other people right here, right now, that might have different political view than you, but is that you're interbeing with both past and present and future. You're interbeing with what you inherited from the past generation, that your work here allows us to also heal that past generation that has received huge amount of suffering, but that our work here also allow us to transmit power into the next generation, and then we ourselves we are healed by the future generation. That we're actually not just interbeing, we're interbeing also in space and time.
Mm. I think that's beautiful. I think there's a really it resonates right at the beginning, that going back to even ideology and the kind of cultural water we swim in, this idea of being ancestors is really a way of, you know, transcending and kind of going beyond the, you know, the individualism of the opposite. I'm just me right now. I don't care about the future. I, you know, that individualism, and also the accelerationism of technology. So there's an aspect of everything that has to be in the next few years. It's only right now. Decades hence is irrelevant because, you know, things are moving so fast, and this individualism go together to create an incredible myopia of the present. Like, we're really just focused on now and the next few years. And I see that again even in philanthropy or other things, where people are like, we don't plan beyond 10 years, we don't plan sometimes beyond 3 years. I remember being with a really major foundation who were funding us at the time, and they said, our strategic plan is 3 years, and after that there'll probably be a new CEO and the strategic plan will change again, so we don't plan beyond 3 years. And I was like,
Wow.
wow, you know, like, okay, you know, at least in their area. And I was like, okay, well, you know, I guess the American Enterprise Institute are going to win then.
But when you say that, it makes me think of my father who plays chess. You know, great chess players can is the ability to hold like not just one or two move down. It's like many moves down.
Yes.
And yes, there's something you just said about the kind of perception as yourself as an individual separate from others, and the kind of acceleration. Um, really yes, there's something of like, oh, reconnecting to also ancient wisdom of like connection with the ancestors, seeing yourself as an ancestor, transmitting to the next generation. And in that, you know, there's the healing, but there's also the atonement, that also we inherited also the hurt, but the hurt that we cause others. Uh,
Mm.
and I think it is also that of like in movement building, you know, at least, for example, when you look at China, like, or even what's happening in the US, is like the US hasn't inherited its civil war and the pain of that civil war. It has inherited the pain of slavery. And we have to acknowledge that inheritance, and we have to look at how we relate how we can heal that. And for me, that is part of movement building in the sense that when you build a movement, uh, human beings have come together to build movement for hundreds of years. It ain't a new social technology. And it's kind of also learning from the past of like, okay, what were powerful movement building from the past, but what are dangerous part of movement building? And I think, maybe in the next episode we can touch a little bit about, because I think there's a lot of fear of dogmatism. There's a lot of fear that movement building would come with like, um, this kind of repression and dogmatism because in a way and that is related to our fear of religion because religion is in a way is movement, is spiritual movement, and that's why it's so powerful because it is spiritual movement.
Right. It's not surprising that the evangelical, like the political movement based on the evangelicals in the US are very effective, and they're partly that underlying it is a spiritual movement and a spiritual energy. And I think that's very, very true. And it's also noteworthy, and I think you wrote a beautiful piece. So maybe we should kind of bring this episode to an end. But just as a trailer, you wrote a piece. I remember, in the secular world, the ego is God, but where you were pointing out that if you looked at like Martin Luther King, if you looked at Gandhi, um, if we looked further back in time, these people were religious men or women. Many of these people that they were that, and that wasn't disconnected from their social and political activism. Or Malcolm X, there were many people who were acting, and they were deeply religiously informed, and that was part of what nourished them. So yeah, I think maybe that this would be a great place to close on today. And what we're, in terms of last words, I think today is like one is what the metaphor over the mountains is we have to deal with collective action. We have to address organize ways to coordinate together and build social and political movements if we are going to go over the mountains. That is going over the mountains. There is no shortcut.
And
That's
maybe
possible.
yes, and maybe another way to frame it's not like we have to come to it. It's like there's an opportunity of coming together, of coming together with brothers and sisters, being on the path, that makes that journey all worthwhile. Like I think
Yes.
what I'm trying to point to is like, okay, like there's something beautiful as we climb that mountain together. And yes, there's danger around the path, but there's something beautiful also in climbing that mountain with others. Alone, we won't survive climbing that mountain. Most mountain climbers, they climb as a collective. They know that you need another buddy and several people to help you make it through. And so in this movement building, there's a joy. There's a joy in climbing together. So that would be how I would end it. Thank you for listening to Over the Mountains. Please continuing following us for our coming up episode. And I wish you a beautiful day. And may you connect with the movement builder in you and the movement participant in you. Maybe look at your ancestors. Where have they might have been part of movements? Maybe you realize that they've been part of movement that failed or movement that succeed, but then did not fulfill on the future they really wanted. Because in movement building, there's also that dimension of like looking at what has worked, what has not worked, and maybe we struggle to create something anew because we're still haunted by the past.